Hey everybody, welcome to For Food's Sake, the podcast bringing you down-to-earth dialogues about the food on your plate and its many impacts on people and the planet. My name is Matteo De Vos, and without further ado, let's talk about food. This week I talk with Mike Velings and Amy Novogratz, the founder and managing partners of Aquaspark, a global investment fund focusing on sustainable aquaculture businesses around the world. Now in this episode, I talk with Mike and Amy about a problem that is often been sidelined and overlooked, and that's the role of farmed fish, shellfish, and plants in addressing some of the world's most pressing environmental food issues. And we talk about the current state of overfishing and how fruitful debate and progress around feeding a growing world population with limited resources is simply inconceivable without addressing the food that we get from our oceans. We'll also address the bad reputation that the aquacultural industry has currently, but also how these problems are being addressed and how we really can't afford to snub aquaculture as part of the solution to global food problems anymore. And then finally, we'll touch upon some of the exciting initiatives and businesses that Aquaspark invests in and the solutions and models that they're coming up with that are truly sustainable, both environmentally speaking and financially speaking, that are scalable and finally in the long term part of the solution. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. Here are Mike Velings and Amy Novogratz from Aquaspark. Amy, Mike, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you for having us.
It's actually the first time that I have two people on, so this will be interesting. Before we get into before we get into sustainable aquaculture or farmed fish, farmed shellfish and plants, as some people know it as, and how that can be a viable and realistic approach to not only, I guess, curbing the problem of overfishing, but also meeting global food demands in the coming decades. I think it'd be great if we could start just with both of you and your backgrounds and how you kind of ventured into this journey of aquaculture and what attracted you to the idea of aquaculture.
All right, so let me start then. I've been an entrepreneur all my life in completely different businesses than fish beforehand, but along the way got involved in trying to set up a marine protected area in the middle of the Pacific. This was 2009. Which eventually got me invited to a floating ocean conference in the Galapagos, which was organized by TED and National Geographic in early 2010, which is where I met Amy. And we came away, she was organizing it, but she'll tell that herself in a minute. And then we came away thinking, well, wouldn't it be nice if we could do something around ocean protection that has a potential to last, where we can really build a business, because, well, for me, that's something that I really like to do, and something that we can really make meaningful around oceans, food security, etc. And we basically stumbled across aquaculture in the months afterwards as a great opportunity and started investigating. Couldn't really believe what we heard in the beginning, and I got more and more interested.
I had been with TED for almost 10 years and was running the TED Prize, which is TED's way of taking kind of a world-changing individual, bringing them to TED. They get to make a wish, and the TED audience hopefully is inspired by this person's work, their wish, and wants to offer resources, their time, office space, however they can help to bring that wish to fruition. I was working with Sylvia Earle, who's an American deep ocean explorer, and her wish was around ocean protection. It was basically before anyone was paying attention to the ocean. Everything was green, and she was kind of screaming, no, the world's actually blue. We need to pay attention to blue. And so as part of her, granting her wish, we took 100 people to the Galapagos. It was basically a kind of a TED at sea, where they were faced with, all of the challenges the ocean was facing, from ocean acidification to overfishing, across the board. And, as Mike said, we met on that boat. It made a lot of sense that we wanted to do something around the ocean because, we both shared a passion and connection to it. Also, our whole kind of connected network, that people we knew in common were all connected to the ocean as well. Right. And when we really found aquaculture and realized just how big it was, and started to really look at the challenges with aquaculture, we realized that a lot of them were really just around connecting the dots. Kind of really, again, with what I did with the TED Prize was fostering collaborations, bringing different groups together, to use different tactics to solve the same problem. And that part of, how we could really add to aquaculture attracted us as well.
Yeah, no, I think you touched upon a really interesting point, which is that, when we're talking about these issues about climate change and about feeding future populations, we tend to overlook what's kind of literally beneath the surface, right? The sea. I mean, the debates often, if you look at The Inconvenient Truth and those types of documentaries, it's often about deforestation, what's above land, the pollution there. But we seem to forget that, almost 2.6 billion people depend on fish as their source of protein, their primary source of protein. So it's, I guess, this kind of huge ice cap under the sea, so to speak, that a lot of people don't seem to realize.
A huge ice cap, and it touches on so many different issues. So there's the environmental thing, the food security piece. I mean, if the fish, if the ocean crashes and we lose that part of the food system, our already really deep troubled food system collapses, right? Yeah, right. You just said it. 2/3 of the world depends on fish as their primary source of protein.
Right, and so Mike, how would you describe the overarching problem that we have? I mean, is it in terms of the oceans? Is it overfishing? How would you describe the way that you see the problem today? And I guess the prospects or the dire prospects if we don't change the current path that we're on in terms of the way we're currently depleting our oceans?
Well, the issue is much bigger than our oceans, but let's start just there. Currently, we fish about 95 million tons out of our oceans globally. 65 million tons of that, 2/3 is for human consumption, and the other third goes into animal feed. And then you have the aquaculture industry, which is slightly larger than what we take out of the oceans globally at the moment. Also about 65 to 70 million tons. So in total, for human consumption, about 135 million tons. So the expected growth in demand by rising populations, rising middle classes, and different diets, etc., is expected to be at least 70 million tons extra. But a ton of scenarios where you would look at what would actually be good for our planet, you could argue that it shouldn't be 70 million tons extra, but even 140 million tons extra, which means basically doubling or tripling the current amount that we take out of the ocean. So if we don't provide a good alternative, somebody is going to fish the last fish out of the ocean and just to eat it, because the pressure on the demand side is going to be so high and that it's basically nobody's going to be able to stop that. That's one thing. Then the other thing is, if you look at, for example, the 1/3 that's being taken out of the ocean for animal feed, and then you could argue that we take an incredibly large chunk out of the ecosystem in one place, which is really damaging our ocean's ecosystems. And yes, there are organized fish meal fisheries that are relatively well organized if you compare it to the rest of the planet, but that's only 30. And then you could still argue about that, but that's only 35% of the global fisheries for animal feed. If you include all the trash fisheries, as they are called in Asia, connected, by the way, to some of the worst slavery issues of our time. Yeah. And then at least 65% of these fisheries are totally unchecked and out of whack. If we need to use for that growth in demand in animal feed, if we are going to need 8 times as much, where is that going to come from? And with a lot of these fishery systems based on quotas, etc., we basically make calculations on the max we can take out of the ocean.
Okay.
To make sure that we can do it again next year. Well, if you go to the max and something happens, and that wasn't foreseen beforehand, a nature event, climate change, and there's a number of things that we can't really foresee, even with all of our collective wisdom. If you tip the balance, you can destroy everything. And actually, we would argue that you would probably would want to be a little bit more on the safe side. To take away that pressure, you need aquaculture. You need an alternative. Otherwise, we're really going to break it.
Yeah, that's interesting because, I mean, I think for a lot of people, and I think specifically, not exclusively, but specifically in amongst vegetarian communities, environmentalists, some at least vegan communities, they would point out the bad reputation of aquaculture. And as you mentioned, Mike, that animal feed, it's feed for fish as well in the aquaculture industry. And so maybe, Aby, could you talk a little bit about the bad reputation that aquaculture has, and some of these major issues that are definitely there, but that are perhaps not insurmountable?
So I will, and just to get there, I'll say that when we first came across aquaculture, and it was at a time where all of a sudden, conservationists who used to think of aquaculture as a dirty word were kind of starting to say, look, it's happening. We actually need it to happen, and so we need to get behind it. We need, intelligent minds to start redesigning aquaculture and to solve some of these problems, or to not make some of these problems.
Right.
And that was one of the big draws to us as well when we first got into this about 8 years ago. Aquaculture, the bad reputation it has is that it uses excessive chemicals, too many antibiotics, that it pollutes and destroys ecosystems. Fish escape, the fish meal problem Mike already mentioned. And the truth is that after a ton of research and development going into these different areas, we actually can do aquaculture really well without any of those problems now. Some of the solutions haven't yet quite scaled. So when you look at kind of the fish meal alternatives and the different feed ingredients that are great for the fish, great for the planet, they're just not making enough of them yet, and so they cost too much. I mean, we'll get more into Aquaspark and why we launched, but our real vision is to scale these solutions and create or to have a really great aquaculture industry that actually it brings comparable returns to today's traditional industry, so that we're not talking about just a few really high value, farmed fish. We're talking about these kind of farming practices being the norm. So looking at alternative ways to battle disease. And there are farming technologies now that flow the water through and constantly cleanse it, so you don't need to use any excessive antibiotics or chemicals. Again, there are ingredient alternatives that don't compromise the planet, like fish meal and soy. So it's happening right now. It's out there, and we need to really put pressure on the seafood industry to let them know that that we care about how our fish is produced, where it comes from. We want healthy aquaculture, and really, again, to really push these practices to become the norm.
Yeah, and if you look at growing animals and vegetarianism, yes, it would be great if everybody would eat plants, but we don't think that with 10 billion people on this planet, that's going to be for everybody, and we think that people will still eat animals. If we then eat animals, it's much better to eat fish, if it's the right type of fish, than any other type of animal. And to give you an example, and that's also why we think that we should actually produce more fish and have that more as an alternative than other animal protein. Because if you compare, for example, beef, where you need 9 pounds of feed for 1 pound of beef and 8,000 liters of fresh water, even though none of these things are ever black and white in agriculture, but just to keep it a little simple. And we farm halibut in Norway, land-based, and a female halibut needs 900 grams of feed for 1 kilo of fish. In other words, the age-old story where we say, well, it's more efficient to just eat the vegetables instead of first giving them to an animal and then eating the vegetables and having less food than begin with. In the case of, for example, this halibut, it's not true, except for the fact that which shouldn't be neglected is that half of that feed is still fish meal. But if we can come up with a good replacement that has a minimal footprint and no fresh water, then we have the most sustainable protein you can imagine, even more sustainable than plants.
And I guess in a sense, kind of what Mike is saying too, with the challenges of aquaculture, is that even really bad aquaculture is better than some of the other alternatives that are out there, like beef.
Right.
But again, we can farm fish really well, so we shouldn't have really bad aquaculture anymore.
So, and if we really want to bring down the footprint of this industry, we need to undertake serious action. If you look at, just to give you a bit of a sense what that means, and now we're just talking fish, we just already mentioned that you need 9 to 18 times as much feed for example, farming beef, let alone water, land use in the feed, etc., etc.
Yeah.
If we are going to produce this extra amount of fish globally, that would imply that we need somewhere between 200 and 300 million tons of extra animal feed for just fish. If you put that a little bit in perspective, people talk about fish meal and fish oil from wild-caught fisheries, which is the most in-your-face issue in this industry.
Yeah.
Industry has been reverting to plant-based alternatives like soy, for example, which is not an ideal ingredient in the first place, to put it mildly. But
sure.
If you think about what that means, the global soy production at the moment is about 275 million tons. That's less what we are going to need extra for just fish. And that current global soy production is already 36% of the Brazilian rainforest. It's almost all of North America. And it's and that's fish, chicken, pork, beef, and humans. The challenges are enormous, and the implications in climate change and resource use, resource depletion, basically, in feeding the planet, in making sure that things stay affordable, also for people that don't have a big wallet, which is still the majority of our global population. The implications are vast, and if you then stack up the numbers and accept that there will be some animal consumption, then the answer is fish and nothing else.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I myself am a vegetarian very much for the reasons you were just mentioning in terms of, the amount of waste there is in the industrial agricultural system, especially. But I'm very much a skeptic first, in the sense that, like you guys are saying, aquaculture in one shape or form, it's the future. We're already producing more fish in aquaculture than we are in the wild, and so I ask myself, be realistic. And not just be realistic, but I guess be hopeful in that there's alternatives that work in aquaculture, and that we can, I guess, move towards a system that's much more transparent, right? I mean, probably the main reason why I'm a vegetarian above all is that I've kind of lost trust in my ability in my immediate surroundings, at least here in Paris, to be able to consistently eat, I guess, meat and fish that I agree with from an environmental perspective. And I think this is where it's so important to keep asking questions and to be transparent and to create a food system that we can essentially trust, and move from there.
Yeah, no, couldn't agree more.
I'd love to hear more. I mean, we've touched about this already, but about AquaSpark, so your investment fund specifically, what it is and what kind of initiatives that you're funding and that you're working with, and tell our listeners a little bit about the stories and the possibilities of scaling businesses, and that there is a solution to in the form of aquaculture?
So our approach is that we invest all the way along the value chain. You're not going to have sustainable aquaculture until you have sustainable inputs, sustainable ways to battle disease, etc., kind of all the way down. So we invest in farms, we invest in feed ingredients, we invest in disease battling, all the way to the supermarket. We have a retail investment. We invest in farms that are doing things really, really well. They might not necessarily be perfect yet, but they're on track to get there, and that are ready to expand. For instance, we have the Atlantic halibut farm that Mike mentioned in Norway. It's a land-based farm that pumps water in from the deep ocean. It has an incredible technology where the water flows through these big, long tanks and then is cleaned, filtered, and goes back into the ocean. And they do a lot of things really, really right. If you were to remove the farm, you'd have no sense that there was ever a farm in that area at all. 99% of all the materials are recyclable. They really care about the fish. They care about the environment. They were producing 50 kilograms of fish and selling them to a pretty high-end market, and we are helping them expand to produce they were producing 50 tons of fish, and we're helping them expand to 800 tons of fish, and to expand their market to reach other territories and start to tell the story of how they fish and what their fish is. We invest in all these companies and then really work with them to coordinate their efforts and help them to benefit from each other. So we've invested in a fish meal alternative. It's a microbial-based fish meal. Microbial-based ingredient that acts as a perfect replacement to fish meal. Our farms will have access to this ingredient. So Sonaqua, the halibut farm, still uses fish meal in their feed, but they will eventually replace that part of their feed with the Callista ingredient.
Okay, so there's like a B2B element there as well, that you kind of promote this ecosystem and this network of social businesses that can help one another.
Yeah, the goal is really to show that you can have healthy, sustainable, and affordable fish with the same financial returns as when you make a mess, basically, or when you do it in a more traditional way. If you want to explain it a bit more gentrified, and show that you can do this with the same financial returns. And for us, that means that we need to make sure that we create an environment where the chance of success for the companies we partner up with and long-term partnerships, and that we create an environment that creates the maximum chance of success. And if we can then connect the dots between good practices, alternatives to non-sustainable feed ingredients, and alongside kick that development in the butt as hard as we can. And we hope to create a following within this industry and new players in the industry, and people thinking, oh, okay, this industry is growing, I'm going to get involved, I'm going to build a fish farm. Or do anything else in this industry, and then thinking, oh wait, if I do it this way, that means that I make the same amount of money or even better. I have a better product, and I don't need to worry about the future. Okay, let's do it this way, and that will be success for us. And that's also why we believe that we need to do this at a massive scale. So. And that's also where our goal comes from, where we want to make the 60 to 80 investments over the course of a decade to 15 years across the globe, across the value chain, across species, across geographies, on every continent, to basically take away any excuse that anybody might have to not do the right thing.
Wow, that's fantastic. You've definitely got your work cut out for you there.
There's a lot of work. But it's also increasingly fun. It was really hard to start and get it off the ground, and in the beginning had to get people to join us. But slowly people are getting more and more excited, which also helps because we got lucky and got a few good results in early on. And the companies we've been invested in have been performing really well, and which makes it easier for people to say yes, obviously. And so there's also a good dose of luck involved. But it's and there's a lot of work ahead, but it's something that feels really achievable. And where if we would have tried to do something similar in a different industry, that's say beef, for example,
right?
And more or less all parts are set. We know everything about the animal, or everything, and like most of it. And there's less growth ahead. You would have to change existing behaviors. Much more difficult than an industry that's basically still in its infancy. Even though it's large, it's only 40 years old in a meaningful way in terms of quantity. And there's an enormous growth ahead. We farm, according to the FAO, close to 700 species now. And we know a little bit about 10 of them. Wow. And we know nothing about the rest. So there's a lot of work still to be done, and it also means that whatever we do now can, how do you say that, spark real change.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, especially in this climate nowadays, if you're looking at governments, their lack of action currently is quite obvious. And so the onus is really kind of on individuals, on companies, and on investors to kind of step their game up and make sure that we get the changes done that need to be done.
And we've seen really great examples in our search for companies, etc., of companies that create great products, but usually those products are really expensive. Right. And that works if you live in Paris, and if you have access, and it works if you live in San Francisco. But really large companies in this industry and the really big food conglomerates look at it and would probably call it a nice hobby.
Yeah.
And they're right. In a way, even though it's people's life's work, it's not going to change how people will be fed in Mozambique and in Africa, for example.
Yeah,
and it's not going to affect mainstream fish consumption even in the Netherlands, which is one of the richest countries in the world. And it all needs to change, and it needs to change at a much more profound level than just the pinnacle of our consumption pattern.
That's a very good point. I couldn't agree more. Maybe a final point, and I think this is also very important for the listeners out there that want to do something and find a lot of these ideas interesting, but don't really know what their role is as consumers. Amy, I mean, what can we do as ordinary consumers to support these movements? Are there labels, or are there things that we can trust in the way that we can eat? Is there hope for vegetarians like me to turn back to certain products that we can definitely trust and rely on?
There are a ton of labels, but the problem is there are too many. There are so many certification schemes and different people labeling the fish that it gets really confusing. And it's really different country to country. And some areas are doing really well. The UK has actually done an extraordinary job educating their public around, paying attention to where their fish comes from. They have a couple of great brands out there that are doing things the right way. And it's catching up fast everywhere, but not fast enough. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, the answer is that buying seafood is way more complicated than it needs to be. I think, finding brands that you can trust, knowing where your fish comes from and knowing how they produce fish and supporting those brands is one very easy first step. Continually asking your fishmonger, just letting them know you want to know. It sounds like a weak point, but it's actually the more people that do, the more retailers start to pay attention.
Yeah.
Depending on where you're based, certain retailers really are taking big strides to do things better. support those retailers. I mean, I think this is an area where the consumer's wallet has a lot of power, and we need to use it in the right way. 5 years ago, when we were kind of out there asking a ton of questions, nobody had any answers. You would go to a fish restaurant, and the servers didn't know where the fish was coming from, and it was shocking. And it's not hugely better now, but it's better, so it's getting there. Depending again where you are regionally, there are NGOs and nonprofits that are certifying kind of different retailers and suppliers, and that do a good job of telling the story there. It feels like what's happening now, and what the easiest way forward is going to be, is that we're starting to really like brands that have stories connected to them. Yeah. We have a company in our portfolio, Love the Wild, that was both a wild caught and aquaculture fish product, a frozen fish that comes with a really delicious pairing sauce. And when we made the investment, they actually got rid of the wild caught fish in their portfolio, moved over to all aquaculture. And it's all the really good aquaculture. And they do a great job of telling the story of those farms, who the farmers are, what farming practices they use. And that seems to really be catching on. And there are different versions of that in different regions. So I think it's being an annoying fish person, and as annoying as you can be, to get people to really start listening and realizing that consumers want to know, and because the consumers have a lot of power here.
Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. I'm glad to see that there's hope for vegetarians like me. Just a final point for both of you. If people want to know more about the work that you're doing, these businesses that you've been talking about that you're working with, is there a place they can go? Is there a website or certain resources that they should look into?
For AquaSpark, we have a website. It's aqua-spark.nl, and have a lot of partners listed up there. There's a great, the fish site is a pretty great site. It's a news site all about fish, basically. So all of the current stories on farmed and wild caught fish and the seafood industry are kind of cataloged there, and it's a great resource.
Yes, and our partner at the World Fish Center .org in Malaysia, they also have a lot of resources around aquaculture and seafood on their website, fishingforafuture.org. That's and I think those things together give people a wealth of reading materials.
The good news is that we have a lot of people out there working closely with us, that well aligned with us. There are a lot of people working on this challenge. So
that's fantastic. I'll be sure to add all of those links in the description below for people to check out. Just finally, are you both on Twitter? Are you active at all on social media that people can follow you on and the work that you're doing?
We have AquaSpark Impact on Twitter, and we have a Facebook page as well. And we post pretty regularly.
Great. Guys, Mike, Amy, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today. It's been fantastic. I think I learned a lot, and I think our listeners did too.
Thank you so much, and thank you for doing what you're doing. This is really important.
Thank you, Matteo.
If you want to have a look at some of the resources that Mike and Amy just talked about, they will be, as I mentioned, in the description below. I'd also encourage, for those of you that are interested in aquaculture, to check out Mike's TED Talk, which is called The Case for Fish Farming, in which he sums up a lot of the issues that we talked about, and he provides further details, and there's a lot more visuals that can kind of help bring the message across. Okay, guys, that's all we have for this week. We'll be back next week again. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you want to support the podcast, as always, you can like us, subscribe, and review on iTunes. That's the best way, the easiest way you can support the podcast. You can also follow what we're up to on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Our handle for all of those platforms is @ForFoodSakeMe. You can also find a list of all the For Food's Sake podcasts on the website. That's at www.forfoodsake.me. And you can also stream them there directly from the website. That is all for now. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.